We landed on the barren planet, the kind of place you could almost feel beneath your skin, silent, cold, and hollow. No animals, no signs of movement, just these towering ruins stretching high above us, skeletal remains of what must have been a once thriving city. As we stood there, the wind stirred up a dry, gritty dust that scraped at our faces. I glanced at the others. No one spoke, though their expression said everything. The pilot, Jenna, was the first to break the silence. You ever wonder why a place like this just dies? Her voice was barely above a whisper, like even speaking too loud might disturb whatever had settled here. Reed, our tech specialist, shrugged, his eyes fixed on the ruined towers. I think I came here just to answer that. To understand something about what we all end up leaving behind. He said it casually, but there was a shadow in his eyes. He'd always had this strange fascination with ruins, remnants, ghostly things of the past. Max, the team's geologist, chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. Well, let's hope we're not the next left behind. As we began to fan out, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't really alone here. Each step felt oddly weighted, like something was watching us, waiting. I dismissed it as nerves, but the feeling lingered. Moving deeper into the ruins, we saw hints of an ancient civilization. Strange, looping architecture, statues with no faces, and markings on the stone. Patterns almost like letters, but not in any language any of us knew. Reed tried scanning them, but his equipment gave only static, and our data readers kept returning an error. It was as if the planet itself was deflecting our curiosity, repelling us. The data said no life detected, but something told me not to trust it. As I moved forward, the shadows seemed to stretch and pull at the edges of my vision. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something, a movement maybe, though when I turned, there was nothing. Just your mind playing tricks, I told myself, but I didn't really believe it. The silence of the place had a weight to it, a pressure that settled over us. I joined Max in one of the larger buildings. He was sifting through piles of strange, crumbling material that looked like petrified moss. He glanced up, pointing to the wall. You see those symbols? I looked where he was pointing. The shapes were scratched deeply into the walls, winding, abstract, almost like spirals or eyes. Maybe some kind of language? I suggested, though I wasn't sure if I wanted to know what they meant. Max nodded, then frowned. I could swear they're looking back at us. He forced a laugh, but I could tell he was unnerved. Out of nowhere, Jenna's voice crackled in over our comms. I found what looks like bodies. Not human. Can you guys get over here? Reed and I exchanged a glance. As we made our way to Jenna, the unease settled deeper in my bones. The planet had felt dead at first glance, but the more we looked, the more we realized it was anything but empty. We found Jenna standing over several twisted forms, half buried in the dust, barely distinguishable from the ruins around them. The remains looked ancient, bones warped and broken, like they'd been left to rot in the open air for centuries. Strange things about them. Elongated arms, empty sockets where eyes should have been, and twisted jaws that seemed frozen in silent screams. What the hell happened here? Max whispered, voice barely audible. Jenna shook her head, her eyes hollow, staring at the remains. Whatever it was, it didn't leave them a choice. Reed tried to crack a joke, but it fell flat, leaving us all feeling more exposed. Standing there, surrounded by crumbling bones and ancient symbols, something primal in us stirred, a deep-rooted fear. We wanted to turn and leave, but curiosity and the need to understand kept us here, kept us rooted to this place. As the day wore on, we regrouped to share findings. Max mumbled something about wanting to go back to the ship, and I couldn't blame him. The planet felt different now, less abandoned, more waiting, like it was holding its breath for us to take one step too far. The shadows grew longer as the sun dipped lower, and an unnatural quiet filled the space between us. I could tell everyone was feeling it. the heavy silence, the inexplicable chill that had seeped into our bones. As we prepared to settle down for the night, I felt a subtle shift in the air, as if something unseen had joined us. There was a gnawing feeling of unease that clung to me, making me glance over my shoulder more times than I could count. This dead world wasn't as lifeless as we had thought. And as night fell, we couldn't help but wonder, had we stepped into something we couldn't escape? The darkness settled around us, an oppressive weight we hadn't fully anticipated. As the last light slipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted, turning the air cold and brittle. We huddled around our small camp, the strange city ruins looming over us, casting long, twisted shadows. Every breath felt shallow, clouding the cold night air with pale wisps that dissipated quickly, like the place itself wanted no part of us lingering here. I tried to distract myself by checking my gear, tightening bolts, testing gauges, focusing on anything that kept me from staring into the void stretching around us. Then Jenna's voice broke the silence, shaky, almost a whisper. Did anyone else hear that? We all froze. Nothing moved, just a faint, endless wind blowing dust across the stone. But then, just faintly, I heard it too, soft whispers carried on the breeze. So faint you could convince yourself they were nothing more than an echo of your own fears. Reed shrugged it off, muttering about auditory hallucinations in strange atmospheres, but his hand shook as he adjusted his radio. No one else spoke, but I could feel the tension coil tighter. When we tried to turn on our lights to chase away the shadows, they flickered erratically, casting strange, shifting patterns. Our comms crackled with static, then cut off entirely. Reed swore under his breath, fiddling with the equipment, but each fix only held for seconds before it fizzled again. Max gave up trying to adjust the scanner. It kept blinking with random blips, little pulses that moved on the edge of the screen, suggesting something there, and then gone. I could see Reed trying to mask his frustration, but I knew he was unnerved too. We all were. Every time I glanced around, it felt like something flitted in the corner of my eye, a shape, a shadow that moved impossibly fast. And each time when I turned, there was nothing but cold darkness. The others must have felt it too. Jenna clutched her arms, pulling her jacket tight, though the chill didn't seem to be from the cold. Max stared into the shadows, his brow furrowed, like he could sense something just beyond our sight. The night dragged on, each passing hour feeding a sense of dread that had crept in, inch by inch. I don't know when it happened, but at some point, our surroundings felt less like a ruin and more like something alive, watching us with an ancient, silent malice. The atmosphere was thick, pressing in on us from all directions. Then, as if pulled by some invisible string, Reed turned his flashlight to an abandoned structure nearby. On his scanner, a faint pulse flickered. Just for a moment, a tiny spark of heat or energy. We exchanged glances, unsure if we should check it out, but curiosity got the better of us. We moved closer, Reed holding his scanner out, trying to get a read. The pulse flashed again, then vanished, almost like it knew we were looking for it. Probably just a mechanical glitch, Max mumbled, but I could hear the strain in his voice. None of us wanted to think about what it could mean if it wasn't a glitch. When we made our way back to the camp, the whispers started up again, stronger this time. They seemed to drift from every direction, voices threading through the ruins, barely audible yet somehow all around us. Every so often, I could catch words, broken phrases, maybe names. But when I strained to listen, they dissolved back into the breeze, mocking me. We sat in silence, wide-eyed, exhausted but unable to sleep. The shadows shifted constantly, twisting with the wind, creating shapes that seemed almost deliberate, like hands stretching toward us. Each time I closed my eyes, I felt something there, lurking in the darkness, drawing closer with every passing second. The hours crawled by, each one dragging us deeper into some unknown fear. I could tell the others felt it too. Jenna's face was pale, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Reed kept tapping at his equipment, each glitch making him flinch. Max sat quietly, staring off into the distance, as if he'd resigned himself to whatever was coming. We spent the night in a restless, terrible silence, waiting for something, anything, to make sense. But the more we waited, the more the feeling grew that we weren't the only ones there. Something ancient, something beyond our understanding, had seen us, and it was letting us know we were intruding. The pulse in that structure, the whispers, they were all signs. By morning, the thin daylight did little to lift our spirits. The world around us was washed in pale, colorless light, and a bitter silence filled the air, as though the planet itself were holding its breath. Reed suggested we push further, deeper into the ruins, claiming we might find clues about whatever happened here. Part of me wanted to protest, but something compelled me forward, a strange mix of dread and fascination. As we descended into a cavernous section of the ruins, a smell, something metallic, faintly sour, hit us first. Then we saw them, scattered among broken pieces of equipment, and tools were the remains of a crew. Not our crew, but other explorers long gone, their bodies left to rot where they'd fallen. The bones were strange, twisted, as if they'd suffered in unimaginable ways before their deaths. Reed's face went pale, and Jenna clenched her fists, her breathing shallow. "We're not the first ones here," Max muttered, barely audible, his eyes fixed on the brittle bones and scorched clothing scraps. What could have done this? It was Reed who answered, but he sounded distant, almost in a trance. Maybe they knew something we don't. Maybe they saw. His voice trailed off, eyes glazing over, like he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. Then he shook his head, as though waking from a nightmare. His hands were trembling. For a while, none of us spoke. We just stared at the bodies, each of us haunted by the same question. Would we share their fate? Reed's behavior had rattled us, but he wasn't the only one acting strange. Jenna kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes darting like she expected to see something lurking in the shadows. Max started mumbling under his breath, as if he were talking to someone we couldn't see. It was Reed, though, who seemed to change the most. He'd pause, listen to something none of us could hear, then keep moving without another word. The rest of us started keeping our distance from him, our unease thickening into fear. At one point, Jenna grabbed my arm. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This place, it's doing something to us." But Max wouldn't hear it. "We're close to finding out what happened here," he argued, his voice sharper than usual. "You want to turn back now, after everything we've seen?" The tension between them was palpable, each glance carrying suspicion. The distrust was spreading, infecting us like a virus, pitting us against each other. I could see it in their eyes, the doubt, the fear. Max's face was set with a hard determination, but Jenna looked ready to run. The planet, the ruins, the presence. It was tearing us apart from the inside out, manipulating us. As we pressed on, the air grew colder, heavier. Shadows moved in the corners of our vision, twisting and stretching, taking on forms that felt too deliberate to be mere illusions. Then we saw it. Something shifting in the distance, a shadow that lingered just at the edge of sight, vanishing as soon as we focused on it. It left marks behind, claw-like impressions on stone, trails of something dark and viscous that disappeared before we could get a closer look. Jenna stopped, staring at the marks with wide, frightened eyes. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered. "This thing, it knows we're here. It's watching us." We stood frozen, hearts pounding as an eerie silence blanketed us. Then a soft, faint sound drifted through the air, a voice calling, gentle yet urgent. It was a voice that was both familiar and utterly alien, like it had been inside our heads all along, waiting to be heard. "Do you hear that?" Reed's voice was barely a whisper, his eyes glazed, transfixed by something unseen. Without another word, he started walking, his steps slow, mechanical, like he was moving in a dream. We shouted after him, but he didn't respond. We could only watch, helpless, as he disappeared into the darkness, the voice luring him further and further away. Then came the scream, high, shrill, filled with a terror so pure it froze us in place. By the time we ran toward the sound, Reed was gone, his flashlight lying cracked and flickering on the ground, blood splattered in jagged streaks nearby. Jenna backed away, horrified, her hands covering her mouth. This is insane, Max stammered, barely keeping himself composed. We're not alone here. This thing, it's real, and it's hunting us. Panic set in as we looked around, expecting to see the creature, the presence, lurking just beyond sight. The realization settled over us like a cold wave. We were being hunted, picked off one by one, and there was nowhere to hide. After Reed vanished, we were left standing in the darkness, each of us gripped by a fear so consuming it was almost paralyzing. The ruins felt different now, less like a place and more like a trap tightening around us. We tried to retrace our steps, hoping to find a way back to the ship, but as we moved, nothing seemed familiar. Landmarks we'd passed before were gone, and passages we swore were there had twisted, shifting in ways that defied logic. It was as if the planet itself was playing with us, folding us deeper into its grasp. Jenna kept glancing around, her breathing shallow. "Are we going in circles?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, as though speaking too loudly might draw attention. I checked the map on my scanner, but the readings were useless. Everything was scrambled, the signal lost. Even time seemed warped, slipping through our grasp. Minutes felt like hours, or maybe it was the other way around. The disorientation clawed at our minds, deepening our growing terror. Then came the whispers, louder now, layered upon each other, echoing through the ruins. They weren't like anything human, yet they tugged at memories and emotions, making it feel like they were reaching inside us. I could barely separate my own thoughts from the voices that called to me, taunting and whispering secrets in my ear. Max stumbled, then glared at Jenna with a wild look in his eyes. "It's her," he muttered, pointing an accusatory finger. She's leading us in circles, isn't she? She's part of this." Jenna's face went pale, and she took a step back, fear flashing across her face. "What are you talking about, Max? I'm as lost as you are." But Max didn't seem to hear her. His face twisted in rage, and he lunged at her, grabbing her by the shoulders and shaking her. "I saw you talking to yourself. I heard you whispering. You're one of them. Admit it." I tried to pull him back, but his grip was iron. Jenna screamed, struggling to break free, her eyes wide with terror. "Let go of me, Max. I'm not doing anything." Finally, I managed to drag him off her. He stumbled back, breathing heavily, eyes darting around as if he expected the shadows to lash out at him. The paranoia had settled deep within him, gnawing away until he couldn't see any of us as allies. Jenna clutched her arms, shaken, her eyes full of hurt and fear. The mistrust between us was no longer subtle. It was a raw, open wound that was only getting worse. Then, in the chaos, we became separated. 1 minute, we were together, moving through the ruins, and the next, they were gone. I called out, but only silence answered. Panic gripped me as I stumbled through the dark, the ruins warping around me, twisting into new paths that hadn't been there before. My mind raced with fear and confusion. Had they left me behind? Or had the entity taken them? Alone now, I struggled to keep my sanity, but every step felt heavier, weighed down by the darkness pressing in from all sides. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, telling me things I didn't want to hear, secrets about my fears, my regrets, things I had buried deep. And worst of all, I could hear voices I recognized. Reed's voice, distant and echoing, calling out for help. Jenna's voice, tinged with sorrow. Max's voice, full of anger and accusation. I couldn't tell if they were real, if they were nearby, or if it was all in my head. The lines between reality and nightmare had blurred to the point of vanishing. Every sound, every flicker of movement sent my heart racing, my breath shallow and quick. Then, in the dim glow of my fading flashlight, I saw it. A figure sprawled on the ground, unmoving. As I got closer, dread pooled in my stomach, threatening to pull me under. It was Max, his body twisted and broken, his face contorted in an expression of pure terror. His injuries were like nothing I'd ever seen, wounds that looked almost ritualistic, like something had marked him deliberately, as if in some sick form of communication. The sight of him sent a wave of horror crashing over me. I turned away, struggling to keep my composure. Whatever had killed Max was something beyond understanding, something that didn't just want us gone. It wanted us broken, twisted by fear and despair before it claimed us. Shaking, I moved away from Max's body, feeling a crushing weight settle over me. I was alone, disoriented, lost in a landscape that was as much a nightmare as it was a reality. I knew then that there was no running from this, no escaping whatever malevolent force lurked in the shadows. If I wanted to survive, I would have to face it, confront the source of this horror head-on. And as I took a step forward, I could feel it waiting, watching, its presence woven into the very stones around me, the darkness itself pulsing with anticipation. The symbols on the walls were almost hypnotic, twisting and warping under my gaze, pulling me deeper into the ruins, further into the darkness where no natural light reached. They glowed faintly, strange runes carved into the stone, pulsing as though alive. Every step I took toward the center filled me with an unnatural dread, but something deeper, a terrible, gnawing curiosity, compelled me forward. I couldn't turn back. Not now. As I moved, the air grew colder, thicker, pressing in on me like a weight. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of those symbols, whispering truths I couldn't quite hear. Finally, I reached an ancient chamber, a hollow, shadow-filled space with high stone walls, each one covered in symbols that seemed to pulse with a sickly glow, casting an eerie light across the cavern. Then I saw it. The entity loomed at the center of the chamber, an immense, shifting form that defied logic. Its edges bled into the darkness, tendrils of shadow that stretched and receded, as though it were tethered to the very walls of the ruin. Its form was spectral yet solid, monstrous yet disturbingly familiar. There was something ancient in its gaze, an intelligence that had watched civilizations rise and fall. It didn't move, didn't speak. Yet I could feel it feeding, drawing on my fear, my despair, the memories that surfaced as I stood there, helpless. A single, terrible thought formed in my mind. This creature had been waiting, feeding on the fear of those who wandered into its domain, sustaining itself on nightmares and dread. I felt its influence pouring into me, dredging up every failure, every regret, every loss that haunted me, forcing me to relive them in vivid, agonizing detail. I stumbled back, my heart racing, every instinct screaming at me to run. But my feet wouldn't move, rooted to the spot as it inched closer, a dark cloud of shifting forms and faces, flickering with memories of the lost. Reed, Jenna, Max. Their faces appeared in the shifting mass, their eyes hollow, accusing. The entity was showing me what it had done to them, what it planned to do to me. But something in me snapped. With shaking hands, I grabbed the one tool I had left, a flare, small and feeble against the dark, but all I could rely on. I pulled it from my belt, fumbling to ignite it as the creature drifted closer, filling the air with its presence, its hunger. The flare sparked, blindingly bright in the darkness, the light cutting through the shadows. The creature recoiled, its tendrils retreating, its form flickering in and out of sight. Taking advantage of its retreat, I moved, throwing the flare directly at it, watching as the light clashed with its form. The creature writhed, shifting, its shadows retreating from the intensity. But the flare was dwindling fast, and I knew I couldn't hold it off for long. My only option was to run, to escape while it was distracted. I turned, pushing through the suffocating dark, stumbling through the ruins as the creature's fury echoed behind me. I could feel it surging, closing the distance. The shadows stretched, twisting along the walls, reaching out to pull me back into the depths of the ruins. With my heart racing, I forced myself to keep going, every step a desperate scramble. My legs felt like lead, but I finally burst out into the open, gasping for air. I could see the faint outline of the escape craft in the distance, a beacon of hope in the endless, desolate landscape. I threw myself inside, locking the door behind me. The craft felt alien, too quiet, too small. I fumbled with the controls, hands shaking as I prepared for takeoff. The ship roared to life, lifting off the ground just as I felt a faint pulse. Like the creature's shadow brushing against the hull, one last attempt to drag me back. As we soared through the atmosphere, I took a deep, shuddering breath. The planet receded below me, its surface fading into the darkness of space. Relief washed over me, but it was tainted by something else, something heavy and dark that lingered, a feeling that something had followed me, burrowed into the edges of my mind. It was as if a piece of that place of the entity had latched onto my thoughts, hitching a ride into the void. As I stared out into the endless stars, I could still feel it, a faint, unsettling presence. It was watching, waiting, its whispers a faint hum in the back of my mind. The entity hadn't been defeated. It had simply shifted its focus, and somewhere in the quiet of the ship, I could still hear its voice.